Good evening, I'm Norman Gukui, and welcome to this night's edition of African Drums. On this particular occasion, we will be looking at human rights of African Guyanese, and we have two knowledgeable people who are our guests tonight, will share their information, their knowledge base on this particular subject. We'll be looking at two periods, the periods 1992 to 2015 and human rights today. Welcome Mr. Vincent Hines and Mr. Vincent Alexander. We just started that, starting from the left to right, starting Dr. David Hines and Mr. Vincent Alexander. And as I said, these gentlemen need no big introduction. They're known. Now, just to kick us off, in the Constitution, Guyana's Constitution, human rights and freedoms are enshrined in numerous articles, right? And I'll just quote up one paragraph. To each and all human rights, these human rights are fundamental. A, life, liberty, security of the person and protection of law. B, freedom of conscience, of expression, and of assembly and association. And C, protection for the privacy of his home and other property, and from deprivation of property without compensation. These are fundamental as enshrined in the Constitution. Could you start then sharing with us what happened and how was these rights, how were these rights viewed and practiced, what practices the country had during the period 1992 to 2015, and then transitioning to 2015 to now. The peers are obvious, right? There's no big discussion. The peers are very obvious, and I think it's critical for us to understand as we go forward what has happened and where we are today, so that we can move forward again as informed citizens.
If I may start, and we deal with human rights in African Guyanese.
It's human rights,
right? And the periodization. But I would like to go back a little bit and to argue that for Black people, African Guyanese and other African diasporan people, the issue of human rights is fundamental to us. I mean, in fact, I would argue that in modern society, it was the African experience that really brought to the fore the question of human rights, because remember what slavery entailed was the removal of the humanity by law and practice of Black people. And so the question of human rights became very important and constant for African people. It's about regaining rights. So that even after emancipation, the question of the restoration of humanity in itself becomes very important. So the question of human rights, I would argue, is central and fundamental to African Guyanese and extend beyond constitutional rights, because their constitutional rights enshrined there in the Constitution. But for Black people, for African descended people, I would argue that it goes beyond that, and it's almost an everyday. It's cultural, it's economic, it's political. And so I just would like to preface the discussion with that, in that for African Guyanese, human rights takes on an even broader meaning than the constitutional rights.
Right. Okay. Now, just to reinforce a little bit what you said, Kofi Annan in 1997. He was the former Secretary General. He said, human rights are the foundation of human existence and coexistence, right? They are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. It's not something that you have options
Right.
So, I mean, but it's very clearly.
Right. You know, in the American Constitution, I mean, they enshrined a lot of the wording there of this whole question of human rights and the equality of human beings and so forth. But that Constitution did not give those rights to African people. So they are human rights for some people in some situations, and not for other people. Yeah, and that's why the discussion of human rights and African Guyanese is so fundamental.
Vincent.
I fully agree with David's perspective. If one is going to discuss human rights of African Guyanese, one has to have a historical perspective, because the formation of the state, the nation, whatever you want to call it, called Guyana, was not built upon universal human rights. In fact, it was built upon discrimination among human beings, starting with the European distribution to the native people, so to speak, the Amerindians. They didn't see them as equals. And then their disposition to the African Guyanese who they enslaved. And I think that was the worst manifestation of the Gulf, because nothing human applied to the African Guyanese, because they were not human beings, they were property. And as the society evolved in the attempt to continue the exploitation of African Guyanese, others were given different conditions that made them more human than African Guyanese. And in fact, what happened was that African Guyanese were not human in the first instance, and when they became human, it was a matter of convenience, and therefore the attempts were made to keep them in a non-human state as far as was possible, whilst others were brought and given incentives to be here, which made them greater humans. So we have that kind of historical beginning to this question of the human rights of African Guyanese. And what has happened is that has impacted not only the level of the legal human rights, but has impacted the level of the disposition of the various groups towards each other, how they see each other, you know. And, you know, for example, and this is kind of fast tracking, but just for the purpose of example, one of the human rights, and the most fundamental one, is the right to life. But in the Guyana context, people very easily arrive at the position that kill them. Kill them, you know? And unfortunately, for whatever reason, this is more about African Guyanese than anyone else. You know? Life doesn't matter. Right? So I think that we have to see human rights from that perspective, the perspective of the history, and the way in which, in our DNA, so to speak, we now have dispositions towards each other in relation to the question of what our human rights are.
Yeah, and if we go back to emancipation was about human rights. It was about legal humanity, but it's also the humanization of the African Guyanese from in a broader sense, and what emancipation brought to the fore was the African contribution to the humanization of the space. Because if the space was about buying people and selling them as chattel and treating them as chattel, so the space was not a human space. And after emancipation, with the village movement and turning this wild coast into a place where human beings can tenant and live as human beings and have human relations, the right to marry, the right to have your kids as your kids and not the kids of the slave master, and so forth. I mean, it was a tremendous human rights movement, and in that sense, I'm putting the village movement within the context of a human rights movement, all right? Because the right to live in your own space, the right to self-determination, the right to organize yourself as a unit beyond the family unit, the community, and so forth, were really about human rights. And so I would argue that that was a big step for us to understand when we come to dealing from 1992. We have to go back there. And that when we come to independence, that was another step in the direction of human rights, because what independence meant was that the independence constitution now had to enshrine a lot of those rights, which, although emancipation happened, the colonial government did not, in a sense, respect those rights. So the independence constitutions really enshrined a lot of those human rights and give African Guyanese a sort of legal cover, as Vincent was saying. I mean, gosh, up to today, I mean, Black lives, I mean, in America they talk about Black lives doesn't matter. And we know that here in Guyana, although we don't use that slogan, all right, in the way in which the state generally, and the way in which others look at Black lives, I mean, and so forth. So the independence constitution here was very important in terms of the human rights of African Guyanese. Of course, the human rights of all Guyanese, but for African Guyanese, it was especially important. And then the social programs that were put in place, the right to education was not, you know what to translate that from just a right in the Constitution to an actual right that people enjoy, right? So when you're talking about a free education from nursery to university, and so it's a tremendous human right for all Guyanese and for African Guyanese in particular, because there was a time when African Guyanese could not, were prohibited from education. So tremendous human rights. The whole question of universal adult suffrage, which we got in 1950, and the right to vote and elect your government. Again, a very important human right. So the period from the decolonization in the late 40s and early 50s up until independence and beyond, I think is very important for understanding human rights from an African Guyanese perspective. The whole question of if your child was born out of wedlock, then he or she was not a legitimate child. The Independence Constitution is really now saying that that child is a human being, a full human being, right? And like I said, it affected all ethnic groups, but for African Guyanese, given the peculiar history, those rights really meant a lot. The right of education, the right to vote, the right for your child, whether the parents are married or not, to be a full citizen, I think, are extremely important. So by the time we get to 1992, 2015, we want to put this in perspective. But Vincent can speak more about some of those things that I introduced.
Still not going to go to 92 again. To reinforce some things which David has said. We know of the issue of the right to life. We've kind of talked about that. Liberty. You know, even after emancipation, you had certain laws that dealt with issues of vagrancy and so that interfered with the movement of people. And these laws were skewed towards a particular group, a particular ethnic group, the African Guyanese. Critical freedom of conscience. The imposition of a particular, in a large extent, imposition of a particular religious cult on African Guyanese, and the prohibition, not only the imposition, the prohibition. So, you, as an African Guyanese, you either had to be Anglican or Catholic. You didn't have a choice, because what you may have wanted to practice was also prohibited.
Yes.
It was prohibited. So the freedom of conscience they were talking about. They inculcated your conscience in a particular way. And the issue then took on gender dimensions as well. And I don't think we should leave out the gender dimension.
We're not leaving out anything.
David partly referred to the gender dimension. You know, and I see this out of some personal experience. Here is a woman who could not bequeath citizenship to her child. It took the father to bequeath citizenship to that child. So this woman did not have that complete legal being that is embraced in this question of human rights. She was partly human. And in some instances, she was not human. She had to rely on other human beings for her own existence. The question of property. The question of property. Clearly, one of the acts of self-emancipation of the African Guyanese was the acquisition of property. And we saw immediately that they started to acquire property. There were conditions imposed upon them in terms of how much they could acquire and what they had to do to acquire. You know, as individuals, they could no longer just step out and acquire property. And what is important to note in all of this, that one could, in many instances, juxtapose what was happening to the African Guyanese to what was happening with other Guyanese. The system was overall exploitative, but in the context of how you treated the human being, there was a disaggregation. There were those who were denied, and there were those who were relatively encouraged. And it's very important for us to reinforce that understanding, because as we come to speak about 92 and beyond, what we're seeing is a number of things. We're seeing that our institutions probably were successors to some of the things that pertained early on, and I think more critical, the psyche of the people kind of reinforced the status quo, and the people here included the political leaders who then, in the position of power, with that psyche affecting them, saw African Guyanese in a particular way, you know, to the extent that one president could have referred to us as being at the bottom of the social ladder. And what is the social ladder? For me, the social ladder has to do with a range of things. And if I was to pick out education, we certainly could never have been at the bottom of the social ladder. But obviously, the social ladder here was seen as the economic ladder. And in that regard, he might have been right.
Yes.
In that regard, he might have been right. But the fault in what he said was that he didn't recognize that the social ladder was not more than, is more than economics.
Yes.
And in describing us as at the bottom of the ladder, he was not proposing how we were to be brought out of that that status. He was just confirming that this is where they are. You know, it's par for the course. This is the bottom of the ladder. You know, so that the psyche post-emancipation, and in this instance post-independence, perpetuated the inhuman disposition to African Guyanese, although the law in many instances sought to present a different picture. You know, and one must never forget that the law operates in two ways. Very often the law follows reality, so that reality precedes people's life, and what is unfolding precedes what the law provides for. And in other instances, the law is put there intending to pull society in a particular direction. I think that we suffer the hybrid. There were instances where there was progressive law that was intended to pull society in a particular direction, and there are other instances where the people themselves had gone ahead of the law. So the very religious movement and all of that was ahead of the law, and then the law sought to catch up with it. And sometimes when the law catches up, in fact, it becomes retrogressive rather than progressive in so-called catching up in regulating a particular thing. So all of that is the platform upon which we have emerged in a society which is not homogeneous, in a plural society, a society where you have different groups, having been treated differently, having a different psyche, and a society where our politics has led to ethnic dominance, so that one group dominates over the other, and therefore the psyche of that group which dominates at a particular point in time is brought to bear on the operation of the state. And I think there is where 1992 and beyond becomes critical, because what we see in 1992 is a political party which has its foundation in a particular ethnic group, and therefore a particular psychological disposition gets its hands on the reign of the state, and probably even subconsciously brings to bear that disposition to the manner of the conduct of the business of the state, and therefore to the manner of appreciation and recognition of people and their rights.
Okay, in part of that you said a lot there, laying a foundation. One thing we need to talk about a little bit, because it also is part of the foundation, which is taken for granted, but it's never talked about. The foundation element is religion, or what is considered religion, or way of life, right? I'm talking about the foundation, the religious foundation, call it religion, religious foundation of that other group, right? And the religious foundation of the African community, or the lack of it, right? Because part of what is propagated, the negative attitudes and all the negative things, also have religious foundations. So it's not only law. It is also something that is part of a culture which is different. It's almost a culture within a culture, right? So in order to understand that, one thing is you must understand is that how the religion forms the basis of that person who is then taking hold of the state, right? And having, it's not something that is just legal or economic. It's something that is more fundamental to that human being, right? And it is based on the religious practices that are totally negative to the African, right? But it is not separate. It is part of that being. So could you talk a little bit about how that component of it reinforces, right? And this is nothing to do with the law. This reinforces who folks are, to the detriment of the African community. In other words, you could say the law says you are good, but if my religion says you are bad, you could talk forever, and I'm still seeing you as the evil, and will treat you as such. So, but this again is a reality, right? It's a reality that we need to somehow factor into. into the picture, how do we lay that as a part of an understanding, the foundation of all the things prior to coming into, as you say, 1992? This is very good, by the way. Thanks for taking us back. Because without taking us back, then we won't get into that. Talk a little bit about that.
Religion is a very important component, and Vincent touched on it. I mean, it's a very important component of ethnic formations, and religion then plays a very positive role in terms of identity and identifying a group.
Right.
And it plays a role in terms of defending that group against cultural attacks from the outside. But it can also play a negative role, that when groups are in conflict with each other,
Plural society.
right?
The plural society. is what
That's
we're talking
when
about.
that's when the religious thing becomes part of the conflict. So my argument here is that the religion itself is not the problem. Is the religion in the context of conflict, and when elements of the religion are used to reinforce dominance and to reinforce superiority, and that's where the problem is. I mean, Dr. King was very clear that the white Christianity was not the same as what he calls the Christianity of my father and grandfather, which they call in America the black church and the black religion and so on. And so here you have this Christianity, but black people and white people are interpreting it differently.
But it also happens in Christianity alone, because there's the Catholic and the Protestant.
Right.
And there is that conflict, but it's how each group. I mean, in one country, for example, Sweden.
Yeah.
Right. They were mercenaries during the war. This is the early days, and when after the Renaissance period, the country split, family split, because some were Catholic and some were Protestant, right? Literally, they're all Christians, but they just could not get together because of their religious. So, but it's so fundamental. It's not only in our situation; it goes back. But we have to recognize that it is a key component, and it has to be dealt with. And cannot be, it's like the elephant in the room. We cannot pretend that it does not exist, because it is a fundamental element of the decision making in the decision making process. Fundamental consideration. Right?
This question of religion, now, African Guyanese, particularly after emancipation, would not have naturally been associated with the Catholic. In fact, even in the period of enslavement, it was the derivatives of the Orthodox churches that were more engaged with African Guyanese than the Orthodox churches themselves. They probably didn't think they should be involved.
The revivalist churches,
now,
so to speak.
But what emerged was a situation where, from a religious perspective, African Guyanese, though they themselves might not have been fully there, are identified with quote-unquote Obio. They might not themselves. And the question of racism immediately steps in, because Obio was seen as something evil, something wrong, something outlawed. And so, in a sense, what that did was to provide for the African Guyanese to be seen in a particular way. So their belief system, which is very often at the very kernel of the existence, was seen as inferior, outlawed, etc. So you have that problem. And that problem is not only about the Europeans, it's about everyone else
Yes.
who were acculturated and socialized to see the African Guyanese that way. And you have to juxtapose that to the fact that whilst you were outlawed in the practices of the African Guyanese, you encouraged and facilitated the practices of others.
Yes. Yes.
So again, it's an element of racism here with superiority as opposed to in inferiority. In the Guyanese context, one also has to see the internal structures of particular religions. If a religion in its own internal structure is built on hierarchical arrangements internally, and they accept that societies are built on hierarchical structures, then it's very easy for them to transpose that internal arrangement into the wider society and to see who fits where. And that allows for the reinforcement of the view that the African Guyanese is at the bottom of the
Well, this is precisely what I was getting at, right? It is not just it has a religious because that religion accepts inequality, right? And we are talking about mutual respect. The two are not in the same book, right? If my religion is based on mutual disrespect and domination, right? And your culture is talking about, and you want a society that is based on mutual respect and mutual acceptance. Every day I go to church, I am hearing we is equal, we is one, and we understand that we are not equal because of our system, right? And that's if every Sunday you go to church, you hear that, and you come into the larger society and people are talking about equality, equity, mutual respect. My core, if I'm part of that other system, is not even understanding what you're saying. But this is our reality, though. We have to realize that inequality and domination are not part of one system, whereas we are looking for mutual respect and equality. So it's like saying mutual respect and equality and domination and inequality. But that's my religion, right? So regardless of what you tell me, that's just my fact of life. So the thing is, do you change that? You can't change that. That is thousands of years of my reality. Domination, as you said, inequality, right, that's my reality. Your reality is mutual respect and equality based on love your neighbor as yourself and all of these good things. That's inconsistent with, as you said, my kernel. But we need to understand that is today. And it's a reality, and how do you deal with that? That is a hard fact. We're not going to, as you say, legislate it. It is more fundamental than that.
But Nippy, whenever I get involved in a conversation on human rights, I like to associate human rights with what I call natural rights. In other words, human rights are not really derived from a legal system.
Right.
Human rights are derived from the realities of life. I mean, there would be no life if we didn't have the understanding that we should respect life.
Yeah.
Then we could just kill everybody and that's it.
Yeah.
That is not a legal construct. It is a natural construct for human existence. And that construct can also apply to the question of property. Somebody owns a property that no one else has the right to take it away. The same construct applies. Now, so that from the human right perspective, and my seeing it as natural rights, one starts off by recognizing at the individual level, irrespective of ethnicity, that these are things which should be attributed to every individual.
Okay, like basic right to life.
Life to life.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Right, these are individual things.
Security.
That is something that everybody is entitled to, regardless.
So we have that as the basic that should be universal. Then you come to the next level, of the community level, where you say, well, like, for example, very often conscience is exercised individually, but there's also a communal thing. And so at the communal level, you say, look, these people as a community have a right, freedom of conscience.
Yeah.
And then you come to the national level. And here is where the question arises. How do you reconcile at the national level individual rights, community rights, and the operation of the state, which imposes a system that is homogeneous to a community that is heterogeneous?
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
And that speaks to the need for the recognition that you have to protect individual rights. You have to protect community rights. But you cannot allow community rights, particularly in a plural society, to become the determinant factor of national arrangement.
Okay.
And so, for coexistence, one has to have a conversation which says, look, here are individual rights we're going to protect, here are community rights we're going to protect, but since our communities are not the same, and they see life differently, we have to have the conversation about how we can coexist by protecting community rights, but at the same time having a mutual arrangement about the rights and operation of the state, and what should be elevated to the level of the state, and what should remain at the level of the community. The problem we've had in Guyana is that we do not accept plurality, and because we do not accept the plurality, we do not engage in a conversation to arrive as how within the plurality, which you can destroy, which you shouldn't destroy, because to destroy it is in the favor of human rights. How do you create a system that provides for the maintenance of individual rights, the maintenance of communal rights, but the establishment of a national system that allows at the level beyond the community for people still to be able to have universality in terms of rights.
Kofi Annan said again, to reinforce what he said, human rights are the foundation of human existence and coexistence. Coexistence.
Yes, and let me, if I may
serious
take the conversation into 1992 to 2015, because I think what is critical there, and this is a follow-up on Vincent, is the dimension of civil rights as part of human rights, where the state has the responsibility to ensure that each group in a plural society enjoys the same rights as other groups.
The state, repeat that.
The state has the responsibility to ensure in a plural society that each group, or that no group is discriminated against when it comes to liberty and those fundamental rights that Vincent was talking about. And I think that's what the problem we had in 1992 to 2015 is that the government of the day used the state to discriminate against one's group. And in the process of doing that, what you're doing is that you're denying them their civil rights, right? Because civil rights is about whether each group is afforded the same rights as other groups, and it's the responsibility of the state to protect each group, because liberty, as Vincent is saying, liberty is an individual right, you know, the right of the individual. But when we come to the right of the groups, that we move now into civil rights, and now it's about what is about protecting protecting. If one group enjoys the liberty, the right to free speech, the right to conscience, the right
Protection under the law.
protection under the law, and you deny that right to some groups in the society, then you're violating their human rights. And so at the question of the discourse of human rights from 1992 to 2015, from my standpoint, was the denial of human rights to African Guyanese, and that this was not accidental. This was intentional, because it was part of the praxis of dominance. And when you go back to segregation in the United States, or apartheid in South Africa, or the Nazi racial domination, you see that operating there, where the rights of black people, in apartheid South Africa, in segregation American colonial Guyana and the Caribbean, right? You see that at work, where there is this deliberate move to ensure that black people do not enjoy the same rights as others. And I think that was the fundamental question from 1992 to 2015, the extent to which this program, this political praxis of dominance included the denial of human rights to African Guyanese.
And this was reinforced with a religious foundation.
Well, yes, religion is part of it. I mean, religion is part of it.
It's acceptable.
It's that religion now is made to work as part of the dominance.
Yeah.
And
it's acceptable.
And I don't want to say all Hindus are people who are engaged in dominance. I know many Hindus who are not into that kind of nonsense, right? But there is a way in which the religion, I think this was the argument Professor Keen Gibson was making, is the way in which you employ the religion as part of your program of dominance. I mean, gosh, white people
do that.
You take Christianity and employ it as part of the dominance, right? And at all times where black people are, we are the victims of that, because the whole notion of inferiority and superiority and the hierarchy, that's part of human. That's part of human formation. And when you know enshrined it as permanent in your religious practices, that's where the problem comes in.
But come back, Vincent, to what you were saying. In a plural society, the rights, the responsibility of the state, because I think the responsibility in enforcing the law, so to speak, is something that only the state can do. Because the individual groups, as you said, the communities have their own framework. So you don't expect them to do that. But the state has the responsibility to put everybody together.
The problem we have when the state comes under the domination of one group.
Yes.
Then there is a coincidence between what that group.
Yeah. Well, this is 1992 to 2015.
However, the question here that's arising is the question of values. What values do you bring to office? And that is where you get a situation of imposition, denial. For example, there are some people in their value system who see people who are involved in business as the only people who are making a real contribution to society development. There are other people who see people involved in service, education, health, and so on, as making a contribution, a serious contribution, equal contribution to society. And what happens is that if the state is dominated by one set of values, in relation to a matter like that, then due regard is not given, due respect is not given to the other set of people who do not embrace or operate under those values. So you undervalue the teacher, you undervalue the nurse, you undervalue the civil servant. The only person that you value is the person who is directly involved in production and the person who is involved in entrepreneurship. That has been a part of our historical problem and has became manifest also in the period of 92.
Yes.
And it became manifest because prior to that period, with an African Guyanese government in place, there was a greater appreciation of the service sector as equally important. And there was a lesser, because even whilst in opposition, if you listen carefully to the theory of the PPP, emphasizing the role of the working people, and not seeing nurses and civil servants as working people, seeing them as petty bourgeois.
That's right.
You could see that the advocacy of the dominance, what do you call it? The thing of the proletariat?
The dictatorship of
the proletariat.
Yes.
Discriminating and these people who are not of the proletariat,
that's right,
who are parasitic. So we have to understand how these things are in our value systems in our psyche. That makes it par for the course. Par for the course to treat one set of people in a particular way. And because you have dominance in the institutions that are supposed to regulate relations in society, because that's basically what the state does, it regulates interpersonal, intergroup relationships. You then bring those values to bear in regulating those relationships. And in so doing, you discriminate against persons whose values are not in consonance with the values that are driving the state.
And Vincent hits on something that we do not speak about a lot in our analysis, all right? Is bringing part of what you are arguing. What you saw with the government in power between 1992 and 2015, it was a fusion of a political ideology and religious social values. And when that fusion came together, it shut out, as Vincent is saying, a whole...
everybody else.
Right, African Guyanese certainly are shut out of that. And so it's not always positively what I do. It's also what I do in a negative way, by excluding people, all right? And often we say, well, they did this, and they can argue, well, we didn't do this, and we didn't do that. One of the things that we have to keep arguing is what you didn't do, who you excluded. And I think that's important. The dictatorship of the proletariat and the dictatorship of social values is a very deadly thing. Many people, Dr. Jagan was an atheist. Most of them in the PPP leadership adhered to communism, which was as an atheistic aspect to it. But yet, they had the support of very, very religious constituency. Right?
For other reasons, because of a kernel that goes deeper.
Right. No, it's a fusion. It's the fusion of the two. It's the political ideology fused with the socio-religious underpinnings of and so forth, and then made it a very potent tool that excluded people. And by the very definition of what you're doing, you had to discriminate against other groups and in the process violate their human rights. And it is why, look, black boys have always been shot on the streets in Guyana, colonial times, pre-independence. But there's a reason why there was a concentration of it during that period. There was a reason why it became part of state and parastate practice. Right? Because it is now part of a larger part of a larger agenda.
Yeah.
And it's the agenda of domination.
Yeah.
And once you are dominating, you have to violate the human rights of those who you dominate. By definition.
Once you accept
yes,
domination as part of your...
That's right. Yeah. You have to violate the human rights of people. Then they're not human beings. They're not entitled to the same kind of liberty as other people. They are not deemed to be people who can exist in a state of your freedom. You construct what freedom is, and then you say, then you determine who can exist in that state of freedom.
The best example of that is the way the justice system is treated. We live in a system that talks about the rule of law. We live in a system that talks that one is not guilty until proven to be guilty. But still, the system, given the value systems at work,
1992 to 2015.
concurs that, look, if you think he's a thief, just get rid of him. The question of the rule of law and the question of is irrelevant.
1992 to 2015.
Is irrelevant. And that is what we have witnessed in this country. And it has become expressly a part of the psyche. You know, it may have started subconsciously, expressly. So people go there and say, look, man, just, you know. And so it becomes very, 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 very clear that a certain set of people are going to be treated in a particular way, and that those who are doing it believe they have the right to do it.
Based on all kinds of things. The foundation, as we said,
the manifest destiny.
Now, we have just a few minutes left. Talk to us briefly then about the turnaround, because that system doesn't exist now.
Well,
so there has been a turnaround.
Well,
the system exists, but let's put it that way.
There has been an opening to the turnaround.
No, yes. Yeah, okay.
Right. Okay. That opening to the turnaround is manifest based on a number of things. On one hand, you have a greater involvement of the African Guyanese in the operation of the state, and therefore their values are now operational. But more than that, and this is what people don't seem to understand about the coalition, is that you've come to a point in the political development of the country where the state is not dominated by one group. The state is subject to a dynamic relationship between two groups, because to a very large extent, notwithstanding the composition of the AFC, what is expected of the AFC is a representation of Indo-Guyanese interests. And therefore, you now have, probably not very vocal, for the first time, whether in antics or otherwise, a real conversation going on about how we'll conduct the affairs of the state. And in so doing, you have to be trading values, you have to be coming up with national values, the things that are national as opposed to the imposition of values of one group, and all of that. And a lot of the criticism of the AFC is that, look, y'all gone in there, you're not representing our values. So you see, right, what is the problem? But the people who are pointing to the problem are not pointing to the solution, saying, well, look, let's find a way to be collective. They're saying, in there, you're not dominant.
You're not dominant.
Which goes back to the kernel of the problem.
Right.
Kernel of the problem.
I want to, in closing, associate myself completely with what Vincent is saying, because I'm not plugging for any political group or any political party here, but I think one of the fundamental changes that has occurred since 2015 is precisely that there's been a break. Vincent call it an opening. I'll give it an added description. There's been a break on the state being a part of a praxis of dominance. And what that break does is that it opens up possibilities, all right, for the state to recognize and defend and protect the human rights of all Guyanese. And I think that's what we're seeing. And that process can be interrupted. it can be interrupted by all kinds of things. Those who want, for example, African dominance of the state, and there's some people who want that, right? And that is understandable. If you were dominated for 23 years, it's understandable that some people want African dominance. And those who, as Vincent said, are saying to the AFC and others, what we want is you to dominate, not to be part of a democratic state that respects the human rights of all.
It is clear that we need another session.
Yes,
because
we got into the 1990-2015.
We have just, but it's important to lay the foundation, all right, so that we get to the point, so that we're not discussing 1992 in a vacuum.
Right.
And I think we did that tonight by laying the foundation and started the discussion of the turnaround and what happened. And where we are and some of the issues, right? So I would like to invite you gentlemen next week, if it's possible, to continue. I'm just trying to make a commitment to the audience here who will be looking. If they would like to hear this further, then we would like to ask you gentlemen to come back, but continue on.
I have no problem coming back in principle, but I'll have to consult on my date.
Date.
And there may be a pun on the date.
Yes. Next week. What date is next week?
What date is the 21st?
Next week
21st is what? No. Sunday is what date?
Today is
the 15th. So next week is going to be the 22nd.
22nd.
That falls in between.
Folks,
I have to work on that.
This has been a very stimulating evening, and I think what it does, it just opens up the discussion of where we are and some of the challenges. And I think going back to the foundation, going back to some of the elements that make the decision makers' roots, I think needed to come out, but they need to be explored further and put within the context of how do we now move forward, given the realities. And the realities, as David said, some are good, some are bad, some are terrible. But we have to look at that as this is where we are. Yeah. And if we need to move forward, then we need to understand your strengths and your weaknesses. And this idea of domination is not, nobody is going to be dominated. Right? And we need to understand that. And so to move forward, we have to come to an understanding. And I think this is part of our program tonight, is to try to give an understanding. And hopefully we'll continue on next week to expand a little more and discuss a little bit more, so that we can all understand some of the things that make the decisions and are the roots of the decision makers, because they're all complicated, not simple. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for tonight. Until next time, I'm Norman Bickler.